Mostly in this field, the focus has been to analyze a network as a snapshot, like try and model the probabilistic mechanism that generates the edges. But recently, with the availability of network populations as well, that I'm going to discuss today, the focus has turned into jointly analyzing datasets that comprise of network observations. This is joint work with Simone Luna Gomez and Robin Mitra, my former PhD advisors. Robin is here today. And Sally Keith and David Jacobi work with the Environmental Center in Lancaster University. They provided the data for the ecological study that I'm going to present in the second part of the presentation. So, yeah, I hope that my plan is not too ambitious.
We always have some technical issues.
It's
try again.
Oh, perfect. So yeah, I don't know if my plan is too ambitious, but I want to talk about two projects today, which is joint work with Simone, Robin, and Sally and David. So I'm going to start with the data, like a very gentle introduction in networks, the problem set up with respect to what we're trying to answer, what are the research questions, and then the next two sections are on the two problems that I'm going to present. First one is on clustering, and the second one is on modeling network populations utilizing directed cycles. And I'm going to conclude with some remarks on future work. So my plan is to stop at the end of section 2 to see if you have any questions, but feel free to ask me during the talk too. So with respect to the data, so in statistics, as we already know, there is a plethora of methods for analyzing datasets where each observation is a scalar. However, there are many applications that involve more complex type of data, which we refer to as networks. And here I have a toy example of a network, which is actually a graphical representation of a network. We call it a graph, we denote it by G. And we have a mathematical representation of this network as a toy example, which is the adjacency matrix denoted by A, indexed by G. So as a toy example, I considered here a small network comprising of 5 nodes and 5 edges. And the edges, as you can see, are undirected in this case. So there's no connection with respect from to a node. And the adjacency matrix is comprising of 0 and 1s, where 0 indicates the absence of an edge and 1 indicates the presence of an edge. So because of this network example being an undirected network, we can represent actually this type of networks just with the upper triangle of the adjacency matrix, because it's a symmetric matrix. So an edge from 2 to 5 and 5 to 2 are both entries in into 5 and 5 to entry in the adjacency matrix. But of course, we have also other types. So these are directed networks, where now we can see that we have an edge that has a direction. And we no longer see that actually the adjacency matrix is no longer symmetric in this case. We might have self-loops, as this case, have a directed network with self-loops. So these are edges that return on the same node, and they appear as ones in the diagonal of the adjacency matrix. Or you can have directed and weighted networks, where now you have a weight on the edges, and you no longer have a binary adjacency matrix, but rather the entries now correspond to the weight of the edge. The focus for these two studies has been binary networks, so assuming only the presence and absence of an edge. We haven't extended this to weighted networks, not yet at least. And we have focused both on undirected and directed data. So I'm going to go in details with respect to this to each project. Specifically, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at populations of networks. So now each observation in a dataset is a network. And now the objective is to jointly analyze this network population to make inferences from their structure, rather than just analyzing it as a single snapshot. And the assumptions are that these network observations are independent, that they are sharing the same set of nodes, and that they are exchangeable. So this is the type of network data that we analyze. This is what we mean by population of networks. And I have two motivating examples for each of these studies that I'm going to talk about. The first one comes from neuroscience, where you might observe a population of networks coming from brain scans taken from different individuals. So this is actually corresponding to real data. It's not a toy example in this case. So the nodes are representing the brain regions, and the edges represent the connections between the brain regions as recorded through a brain imaging process. Here is diffusion MRI, and these individuals were at resting state when these were recorded. So when faced with this population of networks, one research question that arises is whether we can identify underlying clusters of individuals with similar brain connectivity patterns. So this relates to the first project on clustering individuals based on their connectivity patterns of their brains. And the second application is from ecology, and it's actually data that has been collected by Sally Keith from Lancaster University. So in this example, we have a population of networks. Each network corresponds to a coral reef in the Indo-Pacific Ocean, and the nodes represent fish species, and the connections represent aggressive interactions. So here you can see in this example that we have a directed edge, and the direction of the edge indicates where the aggressive encounter started from. So let's say here, species 8 is attacking species 9. Yeah, this is another population of networks. So you have a network from each coral reef, and yeah.
Oh, can I ask what exchangeable?
So with respect to the networks, like the probability distribution is the same. So the network observations are exchangeable.
The observations are exchanged.
Exactly.
Oh,
The
do you
network
assume they're independent?
and independent.
Oh, okay. That's
Yeah.
good.
Sorry.
I thought you meant the nodes are exchangeable, which doesn't seem to apply here. That's why I was.
So for which one?
I thought you meant the nodes are exchangeable.
No, I meant the
obviously it's not
network
true.
observations. Yeah. Yeah. Any other question maybe? So one research question that we have for this population of networks is whether we can make inferences with respect to the competition structure. So these aggressive encounters ultimately correspond to some competition structure, and this is of interest in ecology. So these are two motivating examples, two examples from different fields of studies that network populations arise. And I will try and answer both research questions with the two different projects that I'm going to present. So first, with respect to the clustering of network populations, some background on the literature. As I mentioned, it's a fastly developing field, and there are many modeling approaches already for network populations. However, most of them do not account for heterogeneous network populations. And this was the objective here in the study, to try and infer underlying clusters in multi-network data. There are some studies that are focusing on this problem, very recent as well, but they're either non-model based, and restriction with this is that you don't have an interpretation of the clusters, or they are not very flexible. So there are very rigid modeling assumptions depending on the data that you have. So they're fixed with respect to the application. And what we propose is to have a more flexible model-based approach. So more flexible so that it can be applied to different data sets, different network populations from different fields, but also model-based to have an interpretation of the clusters. And to do that, we formulate a mixture of measurement error models. So we have a mixture model where the components are measurement error models. And the measurement error model process is inspired by Lee et al. We adopted the Bayesian inferential framework for this mixture model that allows us to infer simultaneously all the model parameters. I will describe what inferences we're trying to make here. And this model-based approach that I mentioned, the benefit is the interpretation of the clusters with respect to parameterization, but primarily with respect to a network. So we have a network summarizing the information for each cluster, summarizing the structure of the networks in this class, in each cluster. I will make that a bit more concrete with a toy example. So let's assume that we observe this population, this small population of networks. So what our method is going to do is to infer underlying clusters. The colors are not very clear, unfortunately, but ultimately there are three colors here indicating the three clusters, and we have the membership of the networks. So we want to infer that. We also want to infer a network representing each cluster, which we are going to denote by G star. And this is inferred with respect to a measurement error process. And I'm going to describe what I mean by the measurement error process in the next slide. So we're also making inferences for a network for each cluster. And then on top of that, we assume that the network representatives have some underlying block structure, so that the nodes belong to some unobserved blocks, and the probability of an edge to occur depends on the block membership of the nodes. And as you can see with this toy example, we allow this block structure to vary. It's not necessary to be fixed across the different network representatives. So this is what we're trying to do with this method. And here's what I mean by the measurement error process. So assuming that we observe this population of capital N networks, the assumption is that these are noisy realizations of a latent network G star, which we're going to use in order to summarize information for each cluster. And I have an example here where if you're interested in these two nodes in green, given that there is no edge in the G star network. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Is the G star random or deterministic?
It's a latent parameter.
So G star is fixed,
Yeah,
it's deterministic. It's not a distribution.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. I mean, we specify distribution on the.
Sorry, are you specifying distribution on G star?
Yes,
or on
well,
noise?
with the half block model.
Okay, so it's random.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's random, yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah, so we have this G star network, which is latent. I will describe in the next slides how we model this G star as well. And given that there is no edge between two nodes, the two nodes in green here, there's also the probability of observing an edge in the network data that comprise the network population. So this indicates the case where we falsely observe a network, an edge in the network data comprising the network population. And given that there is an edge between two nodes in the G star network, there's false negative probability Q of not observing that edge in the network data, so falsely not recording an edge. So this is the measurement error process, and each cluster is going to have a G star representative and also a false positive and false negative probability to represent the measurement error process. So this can be interpreted as follows. It's what I described graphically in the previous slide. So given that there is an edge in between nodes I and J in the G star network, then the corresponding entry of the K network observation in the population of networks follows a Bernoulli with probability 1 minus Q. So we have the binary networks here, so it's very convenient. We're going to use Bernoulli distribution. And respectively, given that there is no edge between nodes I and J, then the corresponding entry of the K network observation in the adjacency matrix is Bernoulli distributed with probability, the false positive probability. So yeah, this is the construction of the measurement error process. And then we use this measurement error process to be the mixture components of the mixture model. So for that, we just specify here, we have defined that mixture model as the first case. where we specify Z, Z1 up to Z capital N is denoting the cluster membership of the network data, for G1 up to G capital N. And then we can define the probability, the conditional probability of the network population, given the false, false negative, and the network representative, and of course the cluster membership of the networks. And this is a product of Bernoulli's, is what I described in this slide, where when there is an edge in the IJ entry of the adjacency matrix for G star, you have a Bernoulli with 1 minus Q. When there is no edge in the latent network G star, you have Bernoulli with probability P. And as I mentioned, because of the independence, this product is over the network population and over the edges, which because we also assume independent edges. And just some additional notation. Finally, tau denotes probability of a network to belong to a cluster. And then going backwards, this will answer your question. So the stochastic block model is the assumption here. However, it can be flexible, so you don't necessarily, you can also specify other network models that might be relevant to the application that you have. Ultimately, we consider the stochastic block model because also we have the neuroscience application, and the brain has this structural connectivity where there are brain regions that can belong to different blocks ultimately. And the assumption, so the stochastic block model generally, it's a very commonly used model in the networks, statistical networks analysis literature. And the assumption is that you have nodes belonging to blocks. This is an unobserved block membership of the N nodes for the G star network of cluster C. So this allows to vary, as I mentioned, will allow this to vary, as I mentioned earlier, with respect to the clusters. And then we also have the probability of an edge, which is denoted by theta and depends on the block membership of the nodes. And it's also cluster specific. So this is the form of the stochastic block model, the conditional probability of the network, the G star, given the block membership and the probability of an edge, which is again a Bernoulli distribution. And the product is over the edges. So, so we have what we need here in order to obtain the joint posterior distribution for all the model parameters given the network data, which is proportional to the conditional probability of the observed network data. This is the mixture model of the measurement error. And the times the conditional probability of the latent network representatives, which is the stochastic block model. And for the rest of the parameters, we specify priors, and we use a metropolis Hastings within each sampler. Specifically, I don't go into details, but most of the parameters, we specify conjugate priors, and we have a Gibbs step for updating them. But for the posterior distribution of the G star network, it's not available in closed form, and we use a metropolis Hastings step to update this. So the Gibbs sampler is pretty common, it's pretty straightforward for conjugate priors. You have the posterior closed form. I'm just gonna give a few more details about the metropolis Hastings step and how we update the G star network of each cluster. And I'm going to talk about the proposals. So we have two alternative ways of proposing a new network representative for cluster C. And this is like a random walk here where you perturb the edges of the current network with some probability W, or you stay at the same state with probability 1 minus W. So this proposal distribution cancels in the metropolis Hastings ratio. An alternative way of proposing a new network is to draw independently from a Bernoulli distribution with parameter the mean network from the whole population. So this is slightly more informative. We are taking advantage of the information from the network population, and we propose a new network with this Bernoulli probability to this mean network. So we either accept or reject with respect to the metropolis Hastings ratio. Here, the proposal distribution doesn't cancel, but it's not it's a product of Bernoulli's again, so it's not computationally intensive to obtain. And so far I mentioned what had the formulation with respect to finite mixture model. So when we have fixed and known number of clusters, capital C. But of course, this is not relevant for different applications where you might not know the total number of clusters. And we have alternative ways in the paper for doing this, for determining the optimal number of clusters. This is just like first doing some explanatory data analysis, where you can obtain for different distance metrics between networks, you can obtain a distance matrix and map this through a multidimensional scaling on the 2D plane. But the more formal way that we have is a sparse finite mixture model. And this was proposed by Mantziou and Warwick. So we just follow the steps that Mantziou and Warwick have proposed. And it's also a very easy extension to do like from a finite to move to a sparse finite where you can also make inferences for the number of clusters. So in this case, under the sparse finite mixture model, the number of mixture components are assumed to be more than the underlying clusters. So we assume this same mass instead of capital C that we had previously. And then you have a sparse symmetric Dirichlet to update the prior distribution for the weights tau, which are the weights indicating the probability of a network to belong to a cluster. And we have a state breaking representation for updating those. And then there is also a hyper prior on the parameters of the Dirichlet here is 0. These are also updated with a metropolis spacing step. So this is just a formulation by Mantziou and Warwick, and it actually worked quite well even with the network data that we have. So that's all around the methods. We have a lot of simulation examples in the paper, of course, but I wanted to introduce you to the other project as well, so I'm going to skip that and just show you some results from the neuroscience application, where we needed to have a slight formulation adapted a bit differently to the model as I'm going to describe. So going back to this application, I mentioned that each network is representing the brain connectivity patterns of an individual. And we have here a population of 300 networks, and they're sharing the same 200 nodes. So the brain regions are 200 here. And the research question for this application, we also have another one, but I haven't included that due to time constraints. But for this one, was whether we can detect individuals that have brain connectivity patterns that are different from the rest of the sampling. So here we are trying ultimately to perform outlier cluster detection. And for that, we just formulated the model a bit differently. So now we assume that we have one representative G star. You have a majority cluster with respect to false positive and false negative probabilities. And then you have another cluster, which is the outlier networks that are far away from this G star network compared to the majority cluster. And we have different false positive and false negative probabilities that depend on the cluster, which is the outlier. This is the striking number of iterations. It's always, I see some surprise faces whenever I present this, but now you're not really surprised. Okay, 1 million iterations of the MCMC and 3 different initializations. To justify this very long, MCMC iterations that we have here is because we're making inferences for the network of each cluster as well. So as I mentioned, in this application, we have 200 node networks, and the possible space of graphs, the possible number of networks that we can have is 2 to the power 19,900. So this number corresponds to the possible entries of the adjacency matrix, so the possible edges that we can have. So apparently it's huge, and we explored the convergence through different initializations, and we allowed like the MCMC to run at least for long enough. So I think it took a couple of days to run 1 million iterations for making inferences for the network representative too. And these are the results from the 3 different initializations. But let me explain what each of these networks represents. So the first network here is a posterior mode from 1 million iterations under the first initialization of RMCMC. So the posterior mode of the network representative, where we can see all the connections. I mean, it's hard to see, it's terrible here, but ultimately we see that there are many connections here. However, considering the size of the network, I think the density was around 0.2, so it's not that it's really dense, it's actually the effect of obtaining graphical representation here that makes it so messy. The shade of the nodes indicate the block structure recovered, while the middle network shows only the not in common edges between the posterior mode for the network representative under the first initialization in the posterior mode under the second initialization. So that was a way in order to see how different the posterior modes are under each initialization. And respectively, the posterior mode, then actually showing only the not in common edges between the posterior mode under the first and respectively the third initialization. And also we can see here that the block structure recovered is the same under all 3 initializations. So the convergence is not too bad, remembering that we're exploring this huge space of networks. And I have just one more figure to show on this network population, this clustering method. And in order to see whether we have meaningful clusters for the individuals in this network population, we looked into the neuroscience literature. So and specifically, it's mentioned that a small world structure is associated with cognitive performance. So a small world structure can be described by 2 network statistics: the clustering coefficient, which is the extent to which nodes form triangles, and the average shortest path length, which is easier to understand from the name. And for example, in the neuroscience literature, it has been found that higher intelligence corresponds to shorter path lengths in the brain network. And what we wanted to do here is, okay, take these network statistics and obtain them for each network observation in the population, and see whether we have meaningfully clustered with respect to these 2 network statistics. So we obtained this scatter plot where each point here is a network from the population, and you have the clustering coefficient on the x-axis, the average shortest path length, the second network statistic on the y-axis, and the color, actually the shape of the points here indicate the cluster configuration that has been recovered by the entity.
I think I misunderstood something, sorry. So the clusters are like, there are these different brain types. Is that correct? Or do you only have one type, that like majority type and an outlier type?
Yes, for this one,
Okay.
like we have done a formulation where you have just
Right,
one
just
network
that, and then
and see how far, like a group of network observations that are closer with respect to P and Q.
okay. And so in the next picture, then, so the colors are the blocks
Exactly.
in that thing, and then in the third picture.
It's basically.
Sorry, I mean in the third slide.
The third, this one.
Yeah. What
So
are the colors here?
yeah. So ultimately, it's I haven't labeled by majority cluster, but as far as I remember, this is a majority cluster where the network representative is closer to this group of network observations, and this one is the outlier cluster with respect to how far they are.
Okay.
P and Q. Yeah. Yeah, it's a bit confusing because we do this like different steps for the neuroscience application, but we also have another application where we just experiment with also the different number of clusters and have different network representatives for each. Yeah, so this was encouraging that we have meaningfully clustered individuals, at least with respect to these network statistics, which are relevant in neuroscience. And this is a project that is published in the Annals of Applied Statistics. I will make a quick stop here and have a sip of water and let me know if you have any questions.
So it's outside, it's not virtual. Is there a notion of sparsity when we're doing this network analysis? Like, is there a difficulty if you observe very few networks and very many nodes? Or does that not harm anyone so long as the network you're observing is sufficiently sparse?
I have experimented with different densities of the network. I don't remember that there was actually a challenge with sparser networks, to be honest.
I think the questions are the number of network observations.
Yeah,
If there's few observations.
As sparser with respect to not the density.
yes,
Okay.
yeah, and whether those two things
Okay.
correspond in some way, I guess, with that seems to be several much more sparsity and density.
Yeah. So, yeah, because we use also this sparsity term to describe when a network is has very few connections. Yeah, that's why I feel it. So, yeah, with respect to increasing n, definitely computationally it's more computationally intensive, but we have more accurate inferences. It's what we observe when we increase the network population.
And if you have very few network observations.
It's a bit more challenging when you have very few, but it's still, I don't remember exactly the number of networks that we experimented with. I think we started from 30. It was, yeah, but you could see that there was an improvement as you increase.
Regarding this question, are you excluding edges that you never observed to decrease the space, which you're working with, or you estimate the parameter for all the edges?
For all the edges, yeah, we haven't excluded any. Yeah.
Even if you never observe an edge, you're still somehow considering as a value.
It would be a zero in the adjacency matrix.
Yeah.
So it would just provide the adjacency matrix.
I guess in some applications, I'm not in that sphere, right? But do you have like structural zeros? We call it in like tabular data. So are there certain applications and networks where there are just some edges that can't exist, so that can help reduce your problem?
Yeah.
And just one last question, the idea of using clustering for outlier detection. Is it common? And the other question is it a realistic hypothesis to think that the outliers all belong to another class or no? Because maybe they are really different from each other.
Yeah, that's a very good idea. Actually, it would be interesting to extend this and consider maybe more mixture components, still having a single network representative where we can see a cluster which is closer to that and maybe more smaller clusters for the outlier. But the challenge there depends on the size of the network population, because having very small clusters, you cannot really rely on the you have only a few observations.
Maybe the common approach I have never
In the network population.
using cluster in general. Cluster
Use the idea of an outlier with respect to how far you are from the mean.
from the body.
Yeah, that's the key idea here. So that's why I think. Oh, sure.
There's a question online. I don't know if you can maybe unmute there and say it.
Yeah, it's unmuted already, I think.
Was it? Are you talking about me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Hi. Yeah. So thanks very much. I just wondered. I think you talked a little bit about the MCMC, like the Metropolis Hastings step, and the fact that you were running, I think, 1 million iterations. So I wanted to just get a little bit. Yeah. These steps here. So did you think that this algorithm in the end was good enough? Work pretty well for your examples, or if you had like better, more kind of more sort of sophisticated Metropolis Hastings proposals, would that have been something that would have been really advantageous, or were these kind of good enough?
I haven't explored any other proposals, to be honest. But I guess, yeah, you can get more like clever options apparently. The challenge here, I would say, also is with respect to scalability, like generally using an MCMC for making inferences here for a network population is challenging. So considering alternative differential frameworks would be the case, or even different metropolis Hastings step. But no, we have not considered any other.
But in the examples that you use this for, like, did you have any? Was it painful process getting the algorithm to converge, or was it fine?
So I guess like it was a painful process developing it, but it's not that I would say I had. So maybe with respect to the choice of W's, let's say, for example, here the probability that we perturb the current state of the network. So I played around with different sizes of W, so that I don't have very drastic change. So if I increase a lot of W, then I have more drastic changes, and it would be the new move would be harder to be accepted.
Yeah.
But I would say that from my experimentation, it's mostly around defining the size of the set here of the perturbation. That's mostly it.
I guess I'm not sure convergence is sort of really, I can't think of a better word for it, but in that space, I mean, it's sort of we explored like probably less than 1/50 of the possible set of outcomes there. So but the trace plots look pretty good, didn't they?
The trace plots for the scalar parameter
across the different initialization.
We're linked, right? I mean, we also with this experimentation with the posterior modes, it was not too bad even for these discrete objects. But say, it's hard to say with such a huge space that we have sufficiently explored all the network of the space for us. But we try to control for that somehow with the initialization.
Okay, thank you.
There was another question from okay.
So let me move on. So the second part is around the ecological study that I mentioned. And just to remind you, we have these different aggressive encounters of fish species in the Pacific Ocean. Each network is a coral reef. And here we have a much smaller network population, which makes things easier with respect to the computational component. But still, I mean, there were challenges as I will describe to you because of considering directed cycles in this example. So we have a population of 13 networks comprising of 13 nodes. So the nodes corresponds to the species. And you might wonder why analyzing aggressive interactions between species. So in ecology, it's relevant because it relates to identifying competition structures among species that share resources. And if there are changes in these competitive interactions, these might have a broader effect on the ecosystem function or in the community structure and so forth. So it's something of interest for ecologists to look into competition structures. And a type of competition structure that we can represent in a network is the intransitive competition pattern. And we can represent this type of competition through directed cycles. And an intransitive competition pattern is when no species outcompetes any other species. As we describe also with this illustration. So it's thought to promote species coexistence because of that. And for example, in this Lowry network, this is a directed cycle between nodes 1, 2, 6, and 1. So we can see that there is this formation. So ultimately, if we think that these nodes are species, there is no species out-competing any other species. So there is this cyclic formation. This is another one comprising of 3 nodes. You might have competition structures like state intransitive competition involving more nodes. But for example, this one is not considered a directed cycle because it will start from 3, we go to 5 to 4, but then the edge is not directed showing to 3. So probably under the ecology setup, this species would outcompete the other two species. So this is why we are looking into directed cycles. And specifically, we focused on directed triangles. And this is because of the ecological interpretation, because ecologists focus on 3-node motifs mostly, but also it was very easy with respect to the computation, to be honest, because as you will see with this project too, we're making inferences again for a network, a mean network. So detecting cycles in a network is a very computationally intensive task. So having these directed triangles helps with computation as well.
I think despite a fewer number of nodes in this example, if I remember correctly, this was far more computationally challenging bottleneck we encountered, as even compared to the previous example, right? Because the cycles are really painful to have to compute. Like one time is okay, but
yeah, exactly. But ultimately also it's because of the model that we use, which has a normalizing constant, and we use important sampling. So spoiler alert. But ultimately, yeah, it's going to be sampling from like using an important sampler, sampling new networks for which you need to detect the cycles as well. So it definitely makes a huge difference. Yeah, even from 4 nodes to the 3 nodes. So the question is whether we can use the statistical properties of the network population to make inferences. And for that, we use the model by Gomez et al., spherical network family of models. And the reason why we consider these models is because actually it's a distance-based model. Yeah, before I explain why we choose it. So it's a distance-based model. It has the notion of a mean network, similarly to the measurement error process, but now it's defined as the fresh mean. And a dispersion parameter denoting the variation of the networks from the fresh mean. So it's similar, it resembles a normal distribution where you have a mean and the variance, but now you're in the network space. The reason for considering this model is because it's very flexible. So it's distance-based, and you can specify a distance metric of features depending on the application that you have, and make inferences for the population with respect to the property that you're interested in. However, it comes with a challenge, and this is the normalizing constant, which is intractable. I will show you later how the normalizing constant looks like for this model, and I will discuss how we deal with this too. So what we propose is a novel distance metric. We propose a new distance metric that explicitly accounts for cycles. And the second proposal here is that of a new computational framework for the SNF model to deal with the intractability issue using important sampling. So first, with respect to the distance metric, just to give you some background very briefly here. So we define a distance metric and we indicate it by VG here, where it indicates the distance between the K and the L network observation, and it's a way to quantify similarities between networks. So there is a very nice paper by Jonathan Holmes in the Annals of Applied Statistics that has a nice review of the different network distance metrics that are available. There are ultimately two types of distance metrics: the structural ones, which focus on more local properties of the network, and the spectral distances that are capturing more global properties. And a very well-known structural network distance is the Hamming distance, which you know here by the H, this distance metric, and it's ultimately capturing the not in common edges between two networks. So a limitation when we started working on this project is that there was no distance metric that was explicitly capturing information for cycles. And what we propose is the Hamming symmetric difference distance. For short, we are using this HS abbreviation. And it comprises of two parts. The first part is the Hamming distance, which is just the structural distance that I described, the not in common edges. And it has a second part here, which is a symmetric difference of the directed cycles in the K network observation and the L network observation. So this part explicitly accounts for the not in common cycles. And we also have a weighting factor to indicate which metric plays a bigger role in the resulting HS distance. So we have this HS distance metric that we developed, and we thought, okay, let's try and use this metric with the SNF model. I will give you some background. As I mentioned, it's a distance-based model and allows you to specify any metric. And here is how the conditional distribution of the SNF model looks like. So the conditional distribution of the network observations given the mean network and the dispersion gamma is proportional to this exponential function of minus gamma times the sum over the sum of the distances between the network observations and the mean network. And this model, as I mentioned earlier, it has this normalizing constant which is intractable. It depends on the mean network and on the dispersion parameter. And it's intractable because we ultimately have a sum over the space of graphs for this exponential function. And as I mentioned earlier with the other case, this space of graphs is 2 to the power the number of possible edges for the directed networks is n times n minus 1. So this is growing very fast with increasing n. And yeah, ultimately you cannot calculate that even for the 13 node networks that we have in our application. So the idea is here, okay, we have this as a net model. We can specify the distance metric that we like. This is the HS distance for us. And I will show you the challenges that come with using this. But before that, I just want to mention another special case of the SNF model, which is the SER model, centered Airbus Rayleigh. So when you specify the Hamming distance in this in the SNF model, you may Gomez et al. Have obtained this joint distribution of the networks given again a mean network and a dispersion, which is a product of Bernoulli's. And you can very easily generate networks from this SER model by just perturbing the mean network, the edges of the mean network, with respect to Bernoulli probability alpha. So it's easy to sample from this model, and you will see why this is useful actually. So this is a special case of the SNF model. It's a member of this family of models. And in Gomez et al., what they did is to develop a metropolis Hastings to make inferences for the mean network and the dispersion. And you have the issue of the double interreliability, the normalizing constant depends on the parameters. So this doesn't cancel in the metropolis Hastings ratio. And what they did is to use this auxiliary variable technique by Muller. So in the space of graphs, for that you need to define auxiliary variables. Now, in this time you have networks, so you need to specify these G star networks as your auxiliary variables. And you have a proposal density for these auxiliary variables being this SNF model. So this is in order to cancel, so that the normalizing constants cancel in the metropolis Hastings ratio, you need to specify here the SNF model for it to work. And here also you need to specify an auxiliary density under this Muller technique. And the author has chosen the SER model, which is a member of the SNF model. So the limitations are two. First of all, it's computationally intensive going this way. And the reason is that this step here, where you need to sample networks from the SNF model, you need to another MCMC. So you have an MCMC within an MCMC to sample networks from. But also, we had an issue with when it came to specifying our distance metric, we had very poor mixing using the SNF model. And yeah, I will show you in a later slide the mixing. But what we propose is to use an important sampling step. So this is pretty straightforward. We can just write the normalizing constant as an expectation by just multiplying and dividing by this G density, which is going to be the important sampling density. And then we can approximate this expectation, having this estimator like the sampling mean by drawing networks from this G density and calculating this estimator. And we specified this highest density to be the SER model, because it's a member of the SNF family, but also sampling network data from the SER model is fast. If you recall, I just mentioned that in the previous slide that you just need to have the mean network and perturb it with a Bernoulli distribution, and then you have samples from the SER model. So compared to having an MCMC, within an MCMC, this is much faster. And yeah, if you specify the highest density here, you have an estimator for the normalizing constant. And here is a simulation example from exploring the two approaches, both of them with the Hamilton symmetric difference distance. So because the problem came when we used our distance metric within the SNF model. So on the left-hand side is the auxiliary variable technique that I described, which we can see is really sticking. There are no new rows accepted. There are very few. And here we have an improvement in mixing when we use the important sampling step or the HS distance. But also it was much faster compared to running the MCMC within an MCMC. It was 90% faster than the auxiliary variable. And with respect to the application, so we have implemented this SNF model with the HS distance and using the importance sampling step. And these are just like, this is just the praise plot for the dispersion parameter. But also we have obtained some results for the posterior modes. Again, as I mentioned, we have inferences on the mean network. So we get, actually, sorry, this is not the posterior mode. We just like look into the posterior draws for the mean network. And we identify the most common directed cycles that are present in these, and the proportion of times identified, and whether they are observed or inferred. And as a baseline, we also consider the SER model. So ultimately, it's the SNF model with Hamming distance in order to see the posterior draws for the centroid and close any cycles, any directed cycles or not. And we would see that none of the posterior draws for the centroid and close the directed cycle, even though there were directed cycles in the network population. So there, we can see that there is a benefit of using this distance metric compared to having a baseline model that doesn't account for it. And this is the paper, which is published in Statistical Computing with Lina Gomez, Vibra, and Keith and Jacobi. Actually, I'm not going to stop here. I just have one more slide, and I can take your questions after that. So I finish just one more slide with closing remarks. So yes, I talked about modeling populations of networks, which is a fastly growing body of literature. We propose two modeling frameworks depending on the research questions that we have. There are many future work directions. I have only 3 bullet points here, but yeah, this is very limited compared to the different things that you can extend these approaches for. So one issue is the scalability to large networks. As I mentioned earlier, maybe having different inferencing framework rather than an MCMC could improve computationally at least. Also, we haven't dealt with weighted networks. So we would need to formulate both the model, but also the MCMC. Also, the phase of graphs would be even bigger because by considering different weights, not only the absence or presence of an edge. So it's definitely an interesting route to take, but we haven't. I experimented a bit with the algorithms that I had, but yeah, with no success. But it's an open issue. Yeah, I'm considering also extensions to hydrographs for populations of hydrographs. So these are objects that encode higher order interactions between nodes rather than pairwise. But also recently we have I forgot to include that, but we have Ella with Robin, a CBT student from Warwick, who has started looking into the problem of adapting the SNF model into a regression model where you can have some covariates, scalar covariates, and your response is the network. So having like a weighted fresh mean instead of the notion that I described. So this is another direction. Yeah, thank you for listening. Huge literature here, but yeah, have to take the question.
Any questions?
Thank you very much. In the fish study, the most common directed cycles all seem to be a planet 4. Is that something that was understood? Is that a common directed cycle, or is this a new finding?
Yeah, it's actually our assumption. So there were cycles like even with like bigger sites involving more nodes, but we restricted to only triangles involving 3 nodes. So what you will see is just a repetition of the first node. That's why it's probably difficult for. But it's a triangle ultimately, comprising of all the 3 nodes. It's the important something is that like the normalizing constant that is making this problem even harder, like for going with larger cycles. But at least it was something that was pretty meaningful for the ecologists because they focus a lot as well on 3 node motifs.
It's surprisingly time consuming to enumerate all possible cycles of any length, even in like a 12-node network. It doesn't take long for once, but if you're doing it thousands of times within thousands of parts, if anyone has any thoughts on how to calculate cycle completion, that would be quite good. We tried to approximate it, like when we were unbounding the number of cycles, but that didn't work. Right, we XGBoost, didn't we?
Yes, we tried to predict the number of cycles based on other distance metrics that are faster to calculate. So that distance metrics that potentially can capture this type of property that we're looking into, but not explicitly having to calculate the cycles. Yeah, but it needs just further exploration because it was doing well, but it needs to be investigated more. It's not.